On the national political landscape, the times seemed ripe for a progressive United States president. And one emerged, if only by a twist of fate. Six months after being elected president for the second time, William McKinley was assassinated, and his running mate, 42-year-old Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, succeeded him in 1901. He was the youngest person ever to hold that office. Roosevelt was born into a wealthy family, and although he suffered from asthma, he was determined to live an active life. From marksmanship to horseback riding and tennis, to boxing and hunting, to his heroic exploits with the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt proved a popular leader, first as governor of New York and then as president. When asked why people so adored him, he said he thought it was because,
"I put into words what is in their hearts and minds, but not their mouths."
Roosevelt outlined many progressive reforms to the American public and gave his plan a name, the Square Deal. When Roosevelt assumed office, over 80% of American business was owned by trusts. Although Congress had already enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act, it had not stopped the trusts from using unfair business practices to destroy their competition. Roosevelt began by suing the Northern Securities Railroad Trust. And in 1904, the Supreme Court agreed that the trust had become a monopoly and ordered it dissolved. Roosevelt's administration filed over 40 more suits. They pursued the beef industry, Standard Oil, the American Tobacco Company, and many other trusts. Americans overwhelmingly returned Roosevelt to the presidency in 1904. As he continued his work as a trust buster and a staunch proponent of governmental regulation of business. The many other progressives who were serving in local, state, and federal government helped Roosevelt to get the support he needed to get his proposed laws passed, like Mayor Samuel Golden Rule Jones of Toledo, Ohio, Governors Charles Aycock of North Carolina, Albert Cummins of Iowa, and Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, both of whom became United States senators. 2 years after his reelection, Roosevelt saw the Hepburn Act become law, which gave the Federal Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate the maximum fees railroads could charge. Roosevelt next turned his attention to questions surrounding public health. Like most Americans, he was horrified when he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and even considered becoming a vegetarian. He appointed a commission to investigate Sinclair's claims.
A man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go in the hoppers together.
Sinclair's charges of unsanitary conditions proved to be true. The commission confirmed his description of potted ham as a hash containing ground rope and pigskin. So in 1906, with Roosevelt's urging, Congress adopted the Meat Inspection Act. Federal inspectors would now guarantee safe, sanitary meat. That same year, more reforms followed, with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Manufacturers now had to list the contents of foods and drugs on labels, and could not make exaggerated claims about a medicine's benefits. No deleterious drug, chemical, or preservative could be used in medicines or foods. Roosevelt brought the same enthusiasm to protecting America's natural resources that he did to leveling the business playing field. After graduating from Harvard University, a young Theodore Roosevelt had worked as a cattle rancher in the Dakotas. He quickly realized that ranchers were allowing cattle to overgraze the Great Plains, that farmers had cut down forests and plowed under the prairies, and that America's natural resources were being squandered.
What will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted?
As president, Roosevelt withdrew 148 million acres of forest land from public sale, an area larger than Germany. On the advice of his friend, naturalist John Muir, Roosevelt established over 50 wildlife sanctuaries, 5 national parks, and designated 18 national monuments. He also put fellow conservationist Gifford Pinchot in charge of supervising the national forests.
The nation was obsessed by a fury of development. The American Colossus was fiercely intent on appropriating and exploiting the riches of the richest of all continents.
Roosevelt was so determined that Americans realized that the country's resources were not endless that he even banned Christmas trees in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt ignored tradition and redefined the image and scope of the President of the United States. He chose to be vibrant, visible, and accessible. Roosevelt was the people's choice throughout America, and in turn, America allowed him to use what he called his bully pulpit to accomplish his goals of reform and governmental regulation. However, a third term as president wasn't in keeping with tradition. So, bowing to President, Roosevelt instead handpicked his successor. William Howard Taft, who easily won the presidency in 1908. Taft shared Roosevelt's progressive beliefs, if not his overwhelming popularity. His much more conservative approach to reform disappointed not only the more progressive members of his own party, but the public at large. The fact that the third-party candidate, socialist Eugene Debs, received almost 500,000 votes for president was a clear indication that a great many Americans wanted more radical change than even Roosevelt had pioneered. Now, under Taft's leadership, they felt cheated. Although he was physically large, 6 feet tall and 350 pounds, Taft was no match for the size of Roosevelt's personality and popularity with voters. Taft was a distinguished lawyer and judge, but timid and uncomfortable as a politician. When he lost re-election to Woodrow Wilson in 1912, he returned to his real love, the law, and became the only ex-president to have been chosen as a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He said the White House was the loneliest place in the world.
I don't remember that I ever was president.
Taft's one term as president was not without success, but the bitter political wrangling within his own party distracted the public's attention. Taft actually broke up more than twice the number of trusts as Roosevelt during his presidency. He convinced Congress to pass the Mann-Elkins Act, giving the Interstate Commerce Commission the ability to regulate telephone and telegraph companies. And he urged Congress to pass the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, a federal income tax. It was ratified by the states a year after he left office. Still, Taft was more sympathetic to the demands of the conservatives in the Republican Party than the progressives, and the public believed he was failing to continue Roosevelt's reforms. They were outraged when Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, raising prices on imported goods, and incensed when Taft fired Gifford Pinchot. When Theodore Roosevelt returned to America from overseas in 1910, he was given a hero's welcome. The public urged him to seek a third term as president, and 2 years later he did. However, the Republican Party refused to seat Roosevelt's delegates to their convention, and as a result, Taft was renominated as a presidential candidate on the first ballot. Furious, Roosevelt and his supporters formed their own political party, aptly named the Progressive Party. After, Roosevelt boasted,
"I'm as strong as a bull moose and ready for the fight."
The Progressive Party then became known as the Bull Moose Party. Former friends and party members, now political enemies, Taft and Roosevelt battled each other for votes. Taft called Roosevelt a dangerous egotist, while Roosevelt said Taft was
"A fathead with the brain of a guinea pig."
Meanwhile, the Democratic reform governor, now presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson, championed his own progressive program called the New Freedom to American voters, and wisely steered clear of the bickering between Roosevelt and Taft.
Don't interfere when your enemy is destroying itself.
With the Republican Party votes split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson won a majority of the Electoral College votes and became president.